The first sign that something wasn't right came early one Monday morning. The sun had just started creeping over the horizon, painting the hills in gold, and I was out doing my usual rounds, checking fences, making sure the cattle hadn't wandered too far. Then I heard it, the low rumble of heavy machinery. It wasn't the sound of a tractor or a pickup. This was something bigger. As I rode up the ridge, I saw a convoy of dump trucks rolling down the dirt path that cut through my pasture. Behind them came a grader, a roller, and a crew of construction workers in bright yellow vests. I frowned. None of this made sense. I hadn't hired anyone, and there weren't any county projects scheduled around here. When I got closer, I spotted the words HOA Construction printed on the side of one of their trucks. HOA, as in Homeowners Association. I didn't belong to any HOA. My ranch sat miles outside the nearest subdivision, separated by fences, open land, and a whole lot of paperwork that proved exactly where their property ended and mine began. Yet there they were, unrolling blueprints and marking lines across my pasture like it was theirs to claim. I pulled up beside one of the workers, cut the engine, and called out, "You folks lost?" The guy turned around, looking a bit startled, but not exactly apologetic. "No, sir," he said. "We're starting the new access road." HOA approved it last week, I blinked. "Access road? You're building a road across my ranch." He shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "I just follow orders. You'll have to talk to management." That response lit a fire in me, but I kept calm. I asked to see the permit, or at least the project plan. He hesitated, glanced toward his supervisor, and finally muttered, "We don't carry that stuff." "You'll have to call the office." I looked around. Survey stakes already in the ground, bulldozers revving, and a long chalk line cutting through my property like a scar. They were already deep into it, and judging by the fresh gravel, they'd been working since sunrise. I told them to stop immediately, but the supervisor waved his hand and said, "Sir, we have authorization from the HOA. You can't interfere." That was the moment it hit me. They really thought they were untouchable. I wasn't even angry yet. I was shocked. Who just assumes they can build a road through private land without so much as a conversation? I called the county office right there, and the clerk confirmed what I already knew. There were no public works or county easements running through my ranch. It was all mine, legally recorded and undisputed. By the time I hung up, the workers had already started digging. Dust filled the air, trucks backed up and dumped gravel, and the sound of steel scraping the earth echoed across my property. I stood there watching them, my hands clenched, trying to decide whether to call the sheriff or handle it myself. But a part of me wanted to see just how far they go. So I took out my phone and started recording. Every truck, every crew member, every sign with HOA development project printed on it. I got it all on video. As the day went on, neighbors passing by slowed their cars and stared. A few of them even stopped to ask what was happening. "Looks like the HOA is putting in a new road," one said. I didn't think they could come this far out. "They can't," I replied, keeping my eyes on the workers, "but apparently they think they can." I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. License plates, faces, and progress. The nerve of it all was almost impressive. They had no right, no permission, and no sense of consequence. It was as if they believed my land was just an extension of theirs, something they could use for convenience. When the sun set, I walked the stretch they'd torn up. Fresh tire marks scarred the ground, and the smell of asphalt lingered in the air. That night, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and staring out over the hills. My anger had settled into something colder. Resolve. They thought I was just some rancher they could push around, that I wouldn't know my rights or fight back. But I had something they didn't. Proof. I had the deed, the land surveys, and now I had video evidence of every illegal inch they paved. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I was going to make sure they regretted ever setting foot on my property. What they didn't realize was that by breaking the law so boldly, they were giving me all the ammunition I needed, and I intended to use it. Next on, I drove into the subdivision that afternoon with dust still clinging to my boots and a notebook full of notes, determined to find the person who'd signed off on turning my pasture into someone else's shortcut. The streets inside the development were lined with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, the kind of place where rules mattered and appearances were everything. He met me in front of the model home, clipboard tucked under his arm, the sun catching the gold cufflinks on his shirt. Charles had the polished look of someone who lived by agendas and committee minutes. His smile was the kind you see on people who never have to apologize. He extended a hand and began with a practice line about community improvement, how the board had voted unanimously for a new access point to ease traffic for residents and emergency vehicles. He spoke as if the whole thing was an abstract problem in a meeting room instead of a bulldozer tearing up my land. When I told him the road was on my ranch, his smile didn't change. If anything, it grew narrower. He told me, in a tone that tried for reasonable but landed squarely on condescending, that the HOA had surveyed the area and their engineers had identified an easement corridor that allowed the access. He produced a glossy schematic from his folder and slid it across his knee, pointing to a faint dashed line that, to anyone unfamiliar, looked official. I watched him point as if the motion of his finger made the boundary true. I asked where the easement originated and whether it had been recorded with the county. He said the board's counsel had cleared it, that the engineers had marked the most efficient route, and that residents needed this road more than my pasture did. He used the word efficiency like a shield. There was no urgency in his voice other than the kind that comes from believing you're already right. He suggested casually that I might sign an agreement later to allow the road permanently or sell a strip of land so everyone could move on. When I declined, he tilted his head and said, almost philosophically, that sometimes property lines and progress got in the way of each other, and communities had to make tough calls. That phrase was delivered with the self-assurance of a man convinced the system ultimately favors people who push the hardest. He didn't see me as a neighbor, he saw me as an obstacle. I mentioned permits and county records and watched the color drain from his face for a second, replaced immediately by a practiced, distracted calm. He asked for my patience, suggested mediation, and promised the board would review anything I submitted. I listened while he outlined a timeline for finishing the road, complete with a proposed dedication ceremony for the new neighborhood connector. It was surreal hearing plans for a ribbon cutting that celebrated a ribbon they'd tied across my land. Charles made a show of sympathy, but it rang hollow because every line out of his mouth assumed the road would stay. He admitted without shame that the HOA's approach was aggressive and that their legal team had advised moving forward because inertia often works in favor of whatever's already built. In other words, build first, ask forgiveness later. That admission should have been enough to make me call a halt right there. But I noticed the arrogance in the way he said it, the belief that the system worked for those who took initiative, even if initiative meant trampling rights. It suggested confidence that paperwork could be patched, easements could be reinterpreted, and consequences could be negotiated away. As we talked, a cluster of homeowners gathered, curious and sticky with vacation day leisure, all ready to applaud the convenience. They nodded along, repeating phrases like community good and safety without looking at the map that cut through my property. It was clear many of them had been told the story that benefited the HOA, that this was progress for the greater good. I felt a tightness in my chest, not anger so much as a slow, cold clarity. Charles left me his card and a promise to work this out, which was his polite way of saying they'd proceed until forced otherwise. I walked back to where the machines still hummed in my pasture and realized exactly how dangerous their arrogance was. If they could get the road in place and people started using it, public perception and routine would begin to erase the fact that they'd built it illegally. Their confidence was their weapon, and I had to neutralize it with something they couldn't rewrite: a paper trail, recorded deeds, and witnesses. Charles grinned as he drove off, certain he had the moral high ground. I watched him go and didn't shout or make a scene. Instead, I opened my notebook, checked the deed one more time, and started planning how to turn that smile into his downfall. For the next 2 weeks, I did something that probably confused everyone who knew me. I didn't lift a finger to stop them. Every morning, I watched the parade of heavy equipment rumble across my ranch like they owned the place. Dump trucks hauled gravel, graders leveled the dirt, and a steamroller flattened it smooth. The HOA's construction crew was working fast, like they were racing a deadline. To them, I was just the quiet landowner standing at a distance, arms crossed, camera in hand. But to me, every load of gravel, every concrete pour, every inch of asphalt was one more piece of evidence. They thought I was powerless, that I didn't have the nerve or the money to fight back. What they didn't know was that I had something far more dangerous than outrage. I had patience. Neighbors drove by and slowed down, some shaking their heads, others asking why I wasn't out there with a lawyer or the sheriff shutting it all down. "Why are you letting them keep building?" one friend asked, leaning out his truck window. I gave him a small smile and said, "Because they're building my case for me." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I meant it. Every nail they hammered into my land, every section of pavement they laid, it all became part of the proof that they had trespassed, destroyed property, and committed a full-blown illegal land grab. I documented everything. I flew my drone over the site every evening, capturing crystal-clear footage of the road cutting through the heart of my ranch. I took time-stamped photos, recorded conversations with workers, and even gathered written statements from a few who quietly admitted they weren't sure the HOA actually had the right permits. I could see it in their faces. Some of them knew they were crossing a line, but they were just doing their jobs. The higher-ups, though, they were counting on my silence. They figured if I didn't call the sheriff that first day, I'd never do it. They figured wrong. By the end of the first week, the road had a smooth asphalt layer and fresh white lines. They even installed streetlights like they were putting the finishing touches on a brand new neighborhood. They built a signpost at the entrance that read, "Maple Ridge Private Access, HOA Maintenance Only." That one made me laugh out loud. They were announcing their ownership of something that legally wasn't even theirs. I kept the sign as evidence later. I noticed Charles, the HOA president, showing up a few times, wearing that same smug smile he'd had the day we first spoke. He'd walk around the site with his clipboard, giving orders, talking big to his crew, and pretending not to see me standing at the fence line. But every time our eyes met, I could see a flicker of unease behind his arrogance. He didn't expect me to watch so closely. He didn't expect me to keep so quiet. I didn't want to fight in the middle of a field. I wanted a clean win. So I called my attorney, a sharp, steady man named Davis, who'd handled property disputes for decades. I sent him everything: the footage, the survey maps, the deed copies, even the aerial drone shots. His response was short: "Don't stop them. Let them finish. Then we'll own them in court." Those words hit me like a bell. That became the plan. By week 2, they had the road completely paved and striped. Landscaping crews came in to plant decorative trees along the shoulder. The HOA residents started using it before it was even officially open. Cars zipped down what used to be my grazing field. Kids on bikes rode up and down the new asphalt like it was their personal playground. Every set of tire marks, every footprint, every car that crossed that road only made my evidence stronger. I stayed patient, even when it burned inside to see strangers cut across my land. It wasn't easy watching years of peace in open pasture get carved up. But I knew something they didn't. When you go to court, half the battle is proof. The other half is letting your opponent hang themselves with their own rope. When the day finally came, and they stood around that new road with ribbons and cameras, celebrating their achievement, I stood on my porch, watching it all from a distance. They smiled for photos, shook hands, and bragged about their new shortcut. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't make a scene. I let them have their moment of triumph. Because while they were cutting that ribbon, I was getting ready to cut something else: their confidence. That same afternoon, after the crowd dispersed and the road was officially opened, I made one phone call. It wasn't to the sheriff this time. It was to my attorney. "It's done," I said. "They've finished." He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Good." Now we begin. And with that, the trap I'd been quietly setting for 2 weeks finally closed. The road through my ranch wasn't just a road anymore. It was evidence, built by their own hands, paid for by their own arrogance. And soon enough, they'd learn that the